Like it. You speak back. That's good. It's wonderful to see all of you. What a nice crowd. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name's Gayle Davis. I'm the Academic Vice President and Provost at Grand Valley, the very proud Provost of Grand Valley. On behalf of the university, I do want to just welcome you all. It's wonderful to have our president and Mrs. Haas here this evening. Students, faculty, staff, friends of the university, welcome to all of you. This is going to be an exceptional evening, so I'm glad you could be here to share it. We also have in our audience Fred and Lena Meijer in the front row. Wave. This lecture is not only the inaugural lecture, the distinguished lecture for the Meijer donation to our series. It's also the first of 3 lectures in our Fall Arts Celebration / 50th anniversary celebration. We are happy to have this wonderful occasion, and we couldn't have a better speaker for this occasion than we have tonight. So I'm really very pleased to have all of you. Welcome, and thank you for being here. This remarkable woman you're about to hear, I think many of you have read her works because I see you carrying her books around to be signed tonight. Dr. Jill Conway is just about the epitome of the perfect speaker for Grand Valley. She is liberally educated. She's traveled widely. She's had a variety of experiences, all skills honed to the wisdom that she'll share with us this evening. Earlier today, we got to share a lunch with some of the faculty and students, and it was fantastic. What a wonderful time. Thank you for that time. Hearing the hopeful messages that lots of our students are bringing to their lives and to what they hope to do in the world, it was just really fun to hear that. I can tell you that Dr. Conway has a wonderful sense of humor, a very gentle, kind spirit, fantastic listener and clear thinker. I know it's going to be a wonderful evening. We're so pleased to have you here. Thank you. I want to turn the honor of a full introduction for Dr. Conway over, though, to our wonderful colleague and friend and fellow intellectual, our former president, Mark Murray. Mark has been the 3rd president of Grand Valley. In fact, that's who hired me, and I'm really thankful. He was a former treasurer of the state of Michigan, and currently he's CEO of Meijer Incorporated. Please help me welcome back to our stage our colleague, Mark Murray.
Well, thanks. It's wonderful to be here. The purpose, the fundamental purpose that Fred and Lena set up this scholarship, the endowment for these lectures, is to really be able to explore the question of the relationship between this liberal education that has been absolutely the fundamental basis of all of Grand Valley's years. And 50 years, of course, many things have changed, but it has always been the underpinning. And that relationship with business. And how do we have a true dialogue going back and forth, and that liberal education, that liberating education that is about communication skills, about cross-cultural understanding and experience, the capacity to be skeptical, to know facts but think about the current situation in a different way, and to really be liberated, to be freed up to come at things from a fundamental grounding and trying to do what's good and true and right and will make the world a better place and serve other people. On the business side, markets really are pretty darn powerful disciplinarians. You have to respond to the situations that you face, and that is the great story of the Meijer Company, 76 years in business and continuing to meet needs and explore the change and serve people and deal with facts and deal with the discipline of the market. And it's just wonderful. It is a real honor that the inaugural lecturer in this series is Dr. Conway. I personally, the book that I have read and loved is The Road from Coorain. And talk about facts and coming to an understanding and pressing through fundamental questions. I don't know that there's a chapter that has ever gripped me in any book like the chapter on the drought. It just absolutely, you were there. It was facts. It was emotion. It was longing. It was going forward. It was where we were. It was just, and the whole book was that, and it spoke to a woman coming of age, continuing to challenge and to grow and to continue to see. And of course, at the end we're off on the grand adventure. We're off on the grand journey, and what a magnificent journey, and all the good and all the wonderful things that have been done. It is the loss of the Foreign Service in Australia that they didn't have the sense to understand the great leadership role this woman and other women could have offered them. But Harvard and Toronto and Smith College and Colgate-Palmolive and Nike and so many other places have been the great beneficiary of Dr. Conway's willingness to keep pressing, to keep asking the questions, to keep exploring, to keep getting across cultures, keep being skeptical, but being fact-based and being really willing to continue to challenge, grow, and develop, and to touch everyone who she's had the opportunity to be with. It's a great honor. Very distinguished scholar, very distinguished recipient of dozens of honorary doctorates. This is a magnificent leader in the world of the day. And now we get to find out what happens in the next 50 years. I hope you all have pencil and paper, although we're recording it. What's going to happen in the next 50 years? Thank you, Dr. Conway.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I would like to add my own thanks to the Meyers for creating this wonderful event, and to say how proud I am to be the inaugural lecturer. And I really have enjoyed the chance to meet such a marvelous pair of citizens who make the intellectual world around them thrive. Now, my comments this evening are in three parts, and they then transform themselves into some pretty unregulated, organized thoughts about the next 50 years. I can only think about things historically, so I want to introduce you to the subject of looking at the future by trying to make clear to everyone what are the fundamental grounding forces in society that shape how it evolves. And I'll give you some examples to understand that shaping function, and then I think we will be able to understand better how to think about how those factors might change in the future. So bear with me, I'm really going to get to the subject in not too distant a time. I want to talk first, though, about some ways to think about the factors that historically have been fundamental shaping forces in society. And I'll give you some historical examples of those fundamental forces at work. And I think they'll make the rest of what I have to say easier. If we look through recorded history, there are four key factors that shape the fundamentals of society: climate, topography, the natural environment; demography, the age, sex, and fertility of populations; and myth, the stories that people invent to explain their experience and cope with the tragic dimensions of human life. So if we look at those factors and try to project about them in the future, we may have some interesting talk to undertake. I want to have us look at two kinds of climates and natural environments and examine how they affected a very different demographic group which settled in these two environments in the 17th and 19th century. First, my native Australia. The climate in Australia when the first settlers arrived in the late 18th, early 19th century is Mediterranean, semi-arid, the earth leached by millennia of erosion, so very hard to cultivate, hard to plow. Every agricultural instrument that the first settlers brought along broke because the ground was so hard. There's a narrow, fertile coastal plain, but a flat and increasingly arid interior, and no great rivers for communication. Try and think about a landmass slightly larger than the United States without Alaska, without the Mississippi, without the Ohio, without the Columbia River, and you suddenly understand why it was so hard to settle. And the rivers, such as they are, don't run out to the sea, they run inland and finish up in a Great Salt Lake. So the first settlers got lost very quickly and died of thirst in most of their early endeavors. Demographically, the landscape was occupied by a hunter-gatherer society with no settled seeming residents. And the British settlers were convicts, and although people have tried to romanticize them, they really were the habitual petty criminals of late 18th century English society. And demographically very important, there were 6 to 8 males for every woman transported. So there was little chance of replicating the English village culture that these immigrants had brought with them. And this demographic pattern makes people understand why the society became strongly male-oriented and much emotional life was focused on male bonding rather than domestic life and family. There was no chance of family settlement. The land was too costly to bring into production by a single family. Farming. It was suitable for grazing, which had a high startup capital cost, and it resulted in large landowners and landless workers. So all the efforts to replicate England failed, making it necessary to build a society which valued and respected failure. And its greatest heroes are all failures in a material sense, but existentially grand in their courage. So they're bushrangers like Ned Kelly, the explorers who died of thirst trying to cross Australia like the explorers Burke and Wills, the Australian soldiers sent to certain death at Gallipoli. Now, that may seem a little dismissive, but it's absolutely true that most of the most moving aspects of Australian culture are actually dedicated to understanding and celebrating failure. And so you can understand how the demography and the environment made that the cultural pattern. And of course, there's a key political and economic fact. Only the government has the resources to build the infrastructure because it's too diverse and dispersed to imagine any settler group creating roads, railways, anything like that. So this society accepted, and still does today, the role of government as one of the major drivers of economic life. It wouldn't understand any of the current Tea Party carrying on about undermining the free spirit of American society because people believe, and it's a rationally based belief, that individuals cannot create and shape their own future. And individual initiative won't do it. Now compare that life experience based on that demography, that environment, with the 17th and 18th century of settlement of the Atlantic seaboard, what became the United States. The climate was not unlike Western Europe. The migration was by families. There was excellent soil, ample rainfall, and a family taking up a lot of land could become self-sufficient in one rotation of the seasons. As long as they had potatoes and corn seed, they could make it. And they could finish up very quickly owning their farm, and because it was family settlement, there was very quick population growth, whereas the Australian population hardly grew at all during the founding years. There was, of course, excellent water transportation, so there was no need for government, and it led to the exaltation of the individual and habits of thrift and industry. So we have a situation in which it's possible to replicate family life. You can retain the values that you brought with you about families and their meaning, and you can truly, because of the environment and easy transportation, really achieve self-sufficiency on your own. And that was impossible in Australia. So, of course, that leads to the belief in progress in this country and the value placed on minimalist government. So, those two pictures should make you see how variations in demography and so forth really shape what happens. So that means, I think, that when we look at the next 50 years, first for this region and then for the world, what we know about these basic factors is really the significant way to approach thinking about the future. Now here in the Grand Valley, while there are disputes about the dimensions and intensity of climate change, we do know that we can expect warming, which may change the patterns of agriculture and move the temperate regions north. And indeed, there is evidence that that is already happening in a modest way. This will certainly change domestic architecture and urban design, and will lead to a rather different pattern of agricultural life. We do know that there will be significant population growth, making resources like water not a free good, as it is at the moment, but something we'll have to buy at very high and escalating cost, because the future of the world is going to be shaped by water shortage. So the demand for water will be escalating, and it was mentioned that I've been for many years the director of Nike, so I know how much water it takes to make one of those T-shirts. We sell millions and millions of T-shirts every year. It takes 170 gallons of water per T-shirt. If you take into account the water to grow the cotton, the water to process it, the water to process the dyes, and so on. So every time you look at a T-shirt, think about that. And we certainly cannot continue a process that is so demanding on water supply. We have, in fact, found new ways to develop those T-shirts. I don't know whether anybody watched the World Cup and watched the soccer teams playing, but anybody you saw wearing a swoosh was wearing something that had been made out of the reuse of used water bottles, plastic water bottles. They were entirely made out of plastic. You just take it back to the original petroleum base and turn it into thread. So we can reuse a lot of materials like that in the future, but nonetheless, we really can't be reliant on a petroleum base for the future. It will be a scarce good, very expensive, and it has all sorts of implications in pollution. So we have to think very carefully about new ways to not use that 170 gallons of water and yet give everyone the T-shirts they want. That's one of the major challenges for innovation at the moment. We know also that we have to work to curb our carbon emissions, and that will probably make it necessary to link the producer and consumer of basic resources close together, and that will change the extended supply chains of almost all major producers in this country, and it will affect global trade. But on the other hand, if we have to develop a highly automated system to produce clothing and shoes, we will be able to do it anywhere in the world, and that will free us from some of the problems of an emerging protectionist society. We certainly know, as far as this area is concerned, that because of migration, the population in the next 50 years will be even more diverse than today, and that means that we need to think very creatively about the best way to educate that very diverse population. If you can no longer rely on a commonality of experience, then you need to approach the teaching and conveying of information in a different way. And of course, we need to examine our basic myths. And in this country, I think it's clear that we need to look for pluralism in understanding different faiths and their components, and we should be able to somehow or other develop a culture which understands that all the great religious myths are concerned with universal human experience, and we have to find the language to communicate about it in a way that is not demeaning to any one. So that's one of the biggest challenges for the next 50 years. And I believe that an institution like this one has a tremendous opportunity in the development of its liberal studies, in beginning the process of having that understanding built. And if it's done well, it will change many of the problems that are vexing this society today. Now I move on to what I think are some rather scattered comments on the next 100 years. It's an impossible task to predict that future, and we cannot really understand very much about what the world system will be like 50 years from now. But I'll take a shot at it, and when we get to question time, you can tell me whether you think it was useful or not. First of all, thinking about demographic factors, remember that China allowed only one child, and since the Chinese value the male, it was common to abort a female fetus. So China today has a population of growing young males for whom there are not enough women partners, and that will require a total reorganization of Chinese society and the way they think the family works. So that is true also in India, where it has been customary, because you can detect the sex of a child in the womb, to abort females, so that there is also a great shortage of women in Indian society today. What will that mean? I think there's no way to get around the fact it must affect the position of women in those societies, which at the moment do not value the female very highly. But I think we also have to think about that single son, whether it's in the Indian family or the Chinese. Imagine a child, male child, brought up with two sets of doting grandparents, doting parents, and no competition in the family. And you have young people who regularly answer surveys about who they admire most in the world by saying, myself. So that is a factor to be thought about, because a changing youth culture in China will make an enormous difference to the mores of that country. I think it's pretty clear that within this 5-decade period, China will experience its traditional pattern of dissent and actual rebellion within its ethnic groups. And remember, it's a society with 12 distinct ethnic groups, and those have historically defeated every great Chinese kingdom that was ever established. They always broke it up eventually. Now, it's possible that the current Chinese leadership and management can avoid that, but there are already signs of rebellion against the central government in some of the ethnic areas. Now, of course, China will also be less competitive because of its problems with pollution and shortage of water, even with the damming of the Three Gorges and the effort to steal water from every river system downstream from China is still not enough. So pollution and problems with water supply will be major economic issues for China throughout this 50 years. And of course, I think we all understand that probably the great growth societies in this period will be what we call the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, Indonesia, and China, and that they will be the developing societies whose economic strength changes the balance of power and requires a different set of political arrangements, and they will be really powerful rivals to American markets. And of course, all of them have the goal of developing a consumer society and producing at home. Now, if we think about the world we inherited, I say we because I was part of that generation and alive then, that we inherited at the end of the Second World War, it was clear that we needed an international organization to try to prevent the recurrence of such terribly destructive conflict. And the United Nations was created with a great deal of hope and trust that it would be possible to manage international conflict. It hasn't proved to be so, but it has kept us from a major world war for more than 60 years. However, it's probably likely that in the next 50 years, the sources of armed conflict will be relating to supplies of water and land in the Asia-Pacific world and in the African continent. And so if there is to be a regulation of international conflict in that era, it will have to be a regulation that's created by a new and much more broadly based organization than the UN, which has been dominated by the Security Council, which is the partners of the Second World War, and Russia eventually admitted. So we will need a global institution not dominated by the West that can focus on limiting or managing conflict on raw materials of great importance, and particularly water and land. The myths that will emerge from this transformation of our world, with the greatest productive forces now in South Asia, and perhaps eventually in Russia, the myths that will help create cultural cohesion are bound to come not from Western mythology, but from Asian. And I think it's probably quite accurate to say that Christianity will be a small institution and perhaps renewed by the fact of its decline. It is no longer a universal institution. It will have to go back to some fundamental beliefs and perhaps reconstruct itself. And if I were to think about what would be the greatest export from the West, it wouldn't be our technology and our capacity to produce cheaply. I think it'll be education, because we have in all those emerging countries still a pattern of education which is based on rote learning, not thinking too critically, amassing information but not being able to organize it. And so perhaps our secret weapon is our wonderful education system. And I hope as this institution is thinking about the next 50 years, that there will be some very creative thinking on how that could be done, where to try it out, what could be the economic resources that it realized. And we spend too much time, I think, in the United States and in my native Australia, looking at the rising age cohort and trying to tailor our educational institutions to that group, whereas there is a huge market for what we do and a great need for it in other parts of the world. And we have to get better at doing that and exporting that. So those are my predictions for the next 50 years. I think when somebody is delivering the lecture, which we inaugurate today, in 50 years' time, they will be talking about the contours of a totally different world in which the concentrations of power that need to be balanced off are in Asia, between China, India, and perhaps an emerging Brazil, and the international institutions that need to cope with that will be very different from the ones we have today. And I expect that we will find a need to develop a rather different curriculum. I don't know how much people learn about those potentially major world powers of the future in their undergraduate education. But certainly we need to be able to think creatively and with insight and understanding about those new emerging powerhouses. So that's probably not something that you were all expecting, but that's how I see the next 50 years. And I hope that it would be possible, although it's a big group, that we will be able to move on now to dealing with some questions and comments from the audience and have a real discussion, because that's the best part of any public lecture occasion. So is that possible, Mr. Chairman, to proceed to that next stage of the evening? Okay.
Fascinating. It's an interesting thought, this process, because it really does reflect a meeting or a luncheon or a dinner that I had with Jill a year and a half ago in a restaurant in Boston. And she said, well, what would I talk about? I said, talk about the future. And so it's, I'm glad you took that along and came to it. I think one of the things that I'm here to do is just to call upon people to, I'm inviting questions that can be brought forward so that Professor Conway can answer them in the way she would inimitably do. It's important, I think, to realize that we're dealing with new aspects in terms of language. One of the things I'd like to ask you, which you didn't comment on, was the failure of language in our time and the need for language itself to become a new kind of instrument in terms of thinking towards the future. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, I think that we have a vocabulary that has come out of the 19th and 20th century as far as international relations are concerned, and that we need to change that vocabulary so that we now recognize other kinds of power, other geographic areas where Western European institutions really don't work.
Yes. Well, that was one of the key issues. It seems to me that we rely on a kind of outdated language, like we rely on the old combustion engine sometimes, and we need to think about the way we use it, particularly in terms of our politics and our policies. We watch an outmoded form of reality being proposed each time we turn on the television, each time we read the newspaper. It's never really dealing with the future or indeed of the present, but it's always trying to recreate a past situation through language. So that was the observation I thought was important. But I'm here to ask people, who've got anybody here that would like to further the dialogue with Dr. Conway, and we can take it from there.
We can take a moment and give them
Yes, get us mic to you so that we can.
Yes.
Move the podium away and make it a
Okay.
little bit more friendly.
That'll be fine.
Like so?
Can you hear it? It's not been turned on.
Any chance you can hear me? Ah, great. Wonderful.
Now can you hear me? Yes, you can. Just before we continue this, I've been asked to say a few things about myself. I'm a writer by profession, a creative writer, literary writer, and the issues that Jill have been talking to about today interest me a great deal, but I see it from a point of view of a writer who has to deal with language and deal with the issues, the great ethical issues of our time and the failure of those issues. So from my point of view, it's very interesting to be with Jill on this podium and trying to stimulate discussion amongst us all. And I will try and do the best I can in that respect. So is anybody out there who'd like to start the process?
Yes, here's somebody.
What role does the large religions play in your forecast?
Does the large
Religions.
Well, I do think Christianity is a shrinking religion. I think the Jewish faith is fairly stable in size, and the high growth religions of the world today are Islam and to a lesser extent Buddhism. And I am not a good enough Islamic scholar or Buddhist scholar to tell you how I think those faiths will change in response to being part of the dominant society and the great power groups rather than being always compared to a Western European faith. I think that's something we can't really predict, but it will be a big source of change.
Yes, it's an interesting thought because Islam has not experienced an enlightenment in the sense that we in the European traditions have experienced. And I've often felt that that was one of the critical things that's going to happen or be necessary to happen within Islam for it to burst forward with a lot of new energy. What do you think about that, Jill?
Well, I think that's true. First of all, I'm sorry, I should have repeated the question because I'm not sure everyone can hear. And the question was, how do I take into account religious faith in my various predictions? And my response was to say, I don't know enough to do so, but I believe that Islam is a faith growing now at a faster rate than Christianity ever did at its peak, and that it is one of the major religious forces of the future. And we may want to stereotype the Islamic faith by the actions of a few depraved terrorists, but it is in fact one of the great world religions with a very powerful philosophy, and something we all need to study.
Yeah. Anybody else? Questions? Yes, up the back. Could you speak loud too?
Given the desire of females and procreation, there would be a decline
You know, I couldn't hear. Would you mind? I think those microphones are on. If you wouldn't mind walking out and using one, because it'd be easier for everybody else in the room too. It's not on. No.
Does anybody know how the machine works?
Okay, you're giving me a chance to
Working.
rephrase my question. Given that there is a problem in China with not having enough females
Yes.
for procreation, and that there is also a great possibility, as you said, of political upheaval and an uprising and rebellion, will that have any effect on the influence and the power of China on the world scheme?
My answer to that would be very likely, but very slowly, because China has managed to hold a weakening empire together over historical time very effectively, but it will eventually sap the strength of that economy, I'm sure. But the kinds of rebellions that are occurring at the moment are small scale and very easily suppressed. But when transport and communication is better in China and these groups can reach a larger audience, that will be different.
Yes, sir. If you can come forward too, that'd be a help.
In some quarters, perhaps even here, comments such as yours about the future might be interpreted as bespeaking an inevitable decline of the West. And while I don't think you mean to suggest that, rather you might suggest that these are challenges that we have to think clear-headedly about, rather than taking a sort of defensive, reactionary position and talking about how, taking a defeatist attitude or a reactionary attitude. So I wonder what comments you might make about how to think clear-headedly about the future as a society when the stakes politically are so high.
Well, I'll have a stab at that, and then Jim will probably do even better. I don't mean to suggest that I think Western society and its culture is in decline, but I do think the economic and political power of the old British Empire and its offshoots is absolutely gone, and that similarly the dominance of Western European society is also very much now stabilized at a certain level because almost zero population growth, not replacing itself, dependent on bringing in immigrant labor, but not allowing it to become part of the society. And that's causing great trouble in France and Germany at the moment, and beginning to be in Scandinavia. Those suggest to me that though I don't believe the culture is in any way in decline, that its economic and political reach is being constrained. I don't know, Jim, what would you say?
I would agree with that, but I also would think that there's a requirement on our part of the West to go back to its own values, and that means to revive certain aspects of its historical document, and that means to reflect upon its great tradition in the Greek thinking and great tradition in Latin thinking, all of which we now tend to see as a peripheral part of our social setup. But in fact, it's the core. It underpins Christianity. It underpins the whole way our society is run in terms of democratic values. And so I think we actually need to celebrate for the first time in a long time the values that underpin Western society. And to me, that would be a challenge for a liberal education and a university like this to say, we've got to go back to that. We've got to start thinking as Plato did. We've got to think about what Aristotle said in his time. We've got to go back into that world and get the young people to realize that that's a great adventure too. It's a great intellectual adventure. So from my point of view, that would be one key aspect of reaffirmation of the Western value.
Yes. I recall an essay quite a long time ago that talked about a number of problems which would be occurring in our future. And one of them was information overload. And it talked of the great expanse of knowledge. Now, we've had technology come to the rescue to a certain extent through computers and the internet to help solve that problem. Do you foresee any technological innovations that may help us with some of the world problems like housing or energy? What do you think along those lines?
Well, as far as housing goes, I think one of the experiences of the not-for-profit organizations that are trying to build better housing around the world at the moment is we in the West are still producing quite toxic building materials. And so before we can really be effective in shaping the housing of a homeless population in many parts of the world, we have to find a better way to have less toxic materials to be used in creating that housing. But there are lots of not-for-profits in this country and in Europe working on that whole question. What other innovations might be helpful to us? I think it's too soon to say whether the social media are going to help or hinder. I don't know how other people would view that, but I've been spending quite a bit of time around MIT, and there's a great debate at the moment going on about whether or not the ability to live one's life totally electronically and really never engaging very closely with other human beings is a good thing or not. And whether some of the problems we have at the moment, like bullying in schools and the very cruel use of the social media to expose people's privacy, whether those are going to develop and be problems created by that system. I don't see us having great success with exclusively Western approaches to some of these problems because our technology almost never transports very easily to other societies. I think of a not-for-profit that I worked for a while, which was busy making ovens for women in many parts of Africa where there was great shortage of wood. And the ovens worked very well, but they worked in the middle of the day when the sun was hottest, and women only cook there at night. So our technology was great, but it wasn't adapted to the environment.
Yes.
You've written so powerfully about women in education in the past century, and particularly about women's biographies. And you spoke to that earlier today. But I'm wondering, as thinking towards the future, that women are now the majority, a slight majority of college students in the United States. And yet there's a strong pushback against, a strong pushback from some political elements that really want women to reinforce the family position and the family roles. And in particularly, you're saying that you see the rise of Islam worldwide as well. So I'm curious as to your thinking about women's education in the future, and whether you think where that's going to go in terms of women's roles, and particularly being the president of Smith College and a college of women, a women's college, how you see education of women and women's roles in the future.
Wonderful question. Smith College at the moment is the head of an organization which is called Women's Education Worldwide. And it's a network of every academic institution that exists in the world today devoted to the education of women. And there is a very strong effort through that organization to work on curriculum which will be cross-cultural and which can help examine the position of women in different societies in a non-denigrating way. Some of the keenest participants in that network are the leaders of women's institutions in the Islamic world, and they see themselves as agents of change if only they get enough support from Western institutions, which we're trying to organize. I do think that the demographic factors that have reduced the number of major cohorts of women in India and China and so on can be openings to greater investment in their education and so on. I also think that we can do much better in the not-for-profit world in supporting women's efforts to create their own educational programs in Africa, Asia, Latin America. We have always had a kind of do-good notion of taking our own pattern, whereas what's needed is a much more sympathetic understanding of what their educational needs really are. And so I'm hopeful about that. Really hopeful.
Dr. Conway, from this side of the room here,
Yes.
give us a chance over here.
Yeah.
My question is this. You spoke earlier of the leadership of China, India, Brazil. What do you foresee for the future of the continent of Africa, which has some 50-plus nations? I'd be curious to find out which nations you feel might be the leadership that would help spur that country on, and any sort of a timeline when you would see Africa become a more important worldly power.
It's a very important question, and one that's very hard to answer, because the task in many African countries, before we can get a different kind of education, is to stop child marriage. And that can't be legislated or dictated. It's a very slow process of educating people to the economic damage that's done to a society that enables young girls to be married off at 9 and 10 and to conceive and have their entire reproductive system destroyed by trying to deliver an infant at term through a child's body. So I believe that some of the medical agencies which are working very, very effectively in Africa, Doctors Without Borders and so on, are the front line of the educational system at the moment. And really, until we can get a more healthy age cohort of girls, we can try to educate them all we can, but if they're going to be married off at 9 or 10 or sold, that's not going to be much of a help for the future. So I think it's medical work first.
Yes. Hi, my name is Max, and I'm a freshman currently at Grand Valley. First off, I would just like to thank you for coming and speaking with us today. And secondly, I was wondering if you would be willing to comment on how you see the influence and impact of social networking on human society over the next 50 years.
Well, that's quite a question. I happen to have a colleague at MIT who's just finished a book on this subject. And its title, it's going to come out in a few more months, is Alone Together. And what she means by that is that the interactions between people through the social networking software is not really human contact as we understand it. And what the networks seem to be doing at the moment is having everybody tied to their cell phone or their,
The iPods.
iPods and so on, but not really being socialized as members of society. And that's why, for instance, we are seeing the rise in all these kinds of bullying and cruel interactions with people. Because if you are going through adolescent turmoil and you can take it out on people you don't see, but you can inflict harm and pain, it seems to be a relatively dangerous thing. She has also worked on the study of how children who are cared for by robots or elderly people who are cared for by robots, how that impacts on their human sense of themselves. And in Japan today, it's a society with such a large cohort of elderly people. In all the nursing homes, people are turned in bed to stop bed sores by robots. And it makes the isolation of the elderly even more acute. And children who are cared for by robots also the same experience. So mainly her estimate of the new social networking is pretty negative. And of course, it's fascinating. I mean, you can go into second world, second self, and there's a website for confessing. You tell people in the Roman Catholic Church that the net is making confession a daily practice for a lot of people. They're really blown away. So I'm not sure that the outcomes will be great. It does also seem that young people who start out communicating by texting at a very early age develop a pretty limited vocabulary and they don't read.
Yes, sir.
Water. Water. I noticed in your presentation that you mentioned water quite often, and I think it's one of our state's greatest assets. Do you think it's possible that because of the lowering of the industrial wells and the lakes, that industry may migrate back to the Great Lakes because they can't use salt water because of the corrosiveness?
Wonderful question. Certainly, shortage of water is going to have a powerful impact on the relocation of industry. But it's my understanding that one of the great goals at the moment is to try to design equipment and processes that use much less water. But on the other hand, if you look at the landmass of Asia or Africa, the shortage of water is already critical there. And that's, I think, what's going to trigger all sorts of political conflict in those areas. But I do see the possibility of industry moving back to sources of water, yes, because already it's at such a premium in the semi-arid parts of the United States.
Yes, madam.
I want to go back to something that you said in your presentation also, where you talked about the fact that we need to develop a way to understand our world religions as pointing to a universal human experience, but that this is a really great challenge that we're facing. And I'm wondering if you could speak to us about any best practices that you're seeing in that, or good examples that we could be learning from, and where's the leading edge of that work today as you see it?
A wonderful question. I only know what's being done in residential colleges. So one of the efforts is to develop a chaplaincy that is not affiliated with any particular faith, and to deal with human crises, deaths, terrible illness, something like that, in a multi-faith way, and to try to accustom students to discussing their developmental problems in terms of many different religious traditions rather than just one. But that's a small residential community, and that seems to be happening quite a lot and quite successfully. But what you do with a much larger student body, I don't know, but I think it probably would be one of the curricula and social issues that a wonderfully creative school like this one might tackle.
Can I
Yeah.
may I say something apropos your question? I have a small prediction. That in the next 100 years, we will see a rise again of the monastic institution. I think that the monastic institution has gone through a tremendous ruction in the last 1,000 years, excuse me, but what it embodies is something that we will need to embrace again, because one of the key issues of it is solitude, silence, meditation, asceticism, all of which have been lost in the post-industrial situation, and we've gone through a period of transition where we felt that these valuations had no significance at all. But my feeling is I do a lot of travel, and I do a lot of travel to strange countries like Egypt. And some years ago I did a trip up the Nile and stayed in all the monastic old Coptic monasteries. And I found a huge influx of people going back into monastic life. And I saw cathedrals being built in Luxor for 1,000 people. And I saw a relationship between the monastic institution and the general populace, so that at some occasions when there was a celebration, something like 50,000 people would turn up at the door of a monastery in the desert outside of Cairo to celebrate with the monks. So my feeling is that there's going to be, not necessarily the old monastic institution that we know, like the Trappists and the various groups we've seen in the West, but that I do see some kind of institution being developed where people remove themselves slightly from society in order to address issues of the spirit. So that's my prediction for the next 100 years. Yes.
Dr. Conway, thank you for being here. I have a couple of small questions on your native country,
Yes.
if I may. I've been there several times, and I love the country. And I'm wondering, it's a two-part question. I'm wondering, China is their closer neighbor than to us, and China has been helping its